The first snow of December had fallen lightly on Whodunit, coating the village in a pristine white blanket that made every roofline and tree branch sparkle like a Christmas card. Yet, beneath this picturesque calm, something far darker had taken root. Hamish Macbeth, the village constable, had never seen a crime quite like this one. The report had come in just after 7 in the morning. Mrs. Agnes Maclaren, a wealthy widow known for her impeccable taste and rigid routines, was found dead in her study, a room locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, and no immediately obvious cause of death. The only clue, and it was a curious one, was a single pristine snowdrop placed on her mahogany desk, petals perfectly unblemished, despite the chill outside. It seemed almost deliberately misleading, like a riddle written in white. Hamish arrived on the scene, his boots crunching softly in the snow as he approached the Maclaren estate. The house, normally warm and welcoming, felt unnaturally still, almost holding its breath. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wax polish and faint smoke from the hearth, but there was also that intangible chill of unease. Mrs. Maclaren's study door was firmly locked from the inside, just as the caller had described, and the windows were shut tight, frosted over like the rest of the world. The detective in him recognized the paradox immediately. How could someone have committed murder in a room no one could enter? And why leave a snowdrop as the only message? Ish moved carefully around the room, his trained eye taking in the details others might overlook. A ledger sat open on the desk, though the pages were blank beyond yesterday's date. A half-empty cup of tea steamed gently beside it, the tea leaves still floating on the surface. On a side table, a letter opener glinted coldly, its tip faintly streaked with something that, under the lamplight, might be mistaken for blood, but was not. Hamish knelt and examined the carpet, noting the lack of footprints despite the thick pile. Even the curtains, heavy with velvet, had not been disturbed. It was a puzzle, a contradiction, and a challenge, one that made Hamish's curiosity flare. Whoever had done this had been careful, meticulous, and most of all, cunning. He called for Dr. Brodie, the village pathologist, who arrived within the hour, cheeks flushed from the cold and eyes wide with professional curiosity. After a brief examination, Brodie shook his head. No external trauma, no poison detectable in the preliminary screen. The snowdrop, unusual, but it's hardly a clue. Whoever did this wanted it to look symbolic, perhaps poetic, but it may be a red herring. Hamish nodded, letting the doctor speak, though inside he felt the stirrings of a theory he would not yet voice. A red herring was tempting. A true clue, hidden in plain sight, was far more likely. As the villagers gathered outside, gossiping and shivering, Hamish interviewed the staff, each of whom swore they had seen nothing. Miss Lorna, the maid, remembered bringing Mrs. Maclaren her tea just before bed, but saw nothing unusual. Mr. Fergusson, the gardener, was busy tending the evergreens and claimed to have heard no footsteps. Even the family cat, a sleek Siamese, had stayed mysteriously silent. The absence of evidence was maddening, yet the presence of that snowdrop, so deliberately placed, seemed to mock him. He jotted down notes in his small leather-bound notebook. No entry, no exit, no struggle. Snowdrop. Possible staged scene. Each word felt heavier than the last, pressing on his mind like the thick snow outside. Hours passed, and Hamish wandered the estate, retracing the steps of anyone who might have entered the study. He examined the hearth, the stairwell, the hallways, all the while aware of how meticulously each element of the house had been arranged. And then, almost by accident, he noticed the faintest scuff on the edge of the rug near the fireplace. Not a footprint, not a smear, but a subtle shift in the fibres, as if something heavy had been dragged just slightly to the side. He knelt closer, brushing it gently with a gloved hand. There was a weight here, he realized, a story beneath the story. The snowdrop, the tea, the locked door, they were pieces of a narrative carefully constructed, a puzzle meant to confound any casual observer, and Hamish Macbeth, who had spent his life unravelling the quiet mysteries of Whodunit, understood instinctively that this was no random act of violence. This was a message, a riddle, and he would have to think like the murderer to solve it. By the time evening fell, the sky darkening to a bruised purple, Hamish had formed his first tentative conclusions, though none were yet solid enough to speak aloud. The villagers watched him from the windows and doorways, uneasy, whispering, and full of speculation. But Hamish knew one thing. This crime, which seemed at first so simple, was anything but. It was the kind of case that tested a detective's patience, intelligence, and intuition to the fullest. And somewhere in that silent, snow-covered house, the truth waited, as deliberately hidden and carefully placed as that single mocking snowdrop on the desk. Hamish returned to the Maclaren study the following morning, the winter light filtering weakly through the frost-smeared windows, casting long shadows across the polished floorboards. Though the room appeared unchanged from yesterday, he had a sense that each detail might reveal its secret if observed with the right lens. Inspector Clough, sent from the regional office, had arrived the previous night, and was busily cataloguing evidence and questioning the staff. But Hamish noted the familiar procedural tunnel vision. The inspector was focused on the obvious, the tangible, and the documented, while Hamish's instinct told him that the smallest, almost imperceptible oddities would be the key. As Clough moved from item to item, taking photographs and notes, Hamish's gaze fell upon the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was a display of family portraits and modest ornaments, but one small frame, tilted ever so slightly, caught his attention. He straightened it gently, and discovered a faint smudge along its edge, as if someone had touched it in a hurry, or perhaps in hesitation. It was the kind of detail most would dismiss as careless dusting, yet Hamish's trained eye recognized it as the first whisper of deception. Someone had been here, and had tried, however subtly, to hide the trace of their presence. He moved closer to the desk where the infamous snowdrop still rested. Something about it gnawed at him. The flower was too pristine, almost artificial in its perfection, as though it had been chosen for its symbolism rather than found naturally. Hamish lifted it delicately and examined the stem. There was a faint smear of wax on it, not from a candle but from a seal, perhaps the sealing of a letter or a package. A message, he realized, had been sent, hidden in plain sight. He placed the snowdrop back on the desk, letting it occupy the same position that had first seemed so meaningless, and noted the subtle implication. The murderer wanted to be noticed, but only by someone attentive enough to recognize the message. Hamish's attention shifted to the chair in which Mrs. Maclaren had likely been sitting. The cushion was slightly compressed, though the room had been undisturbed since the discovery. He pressed lightly, and a faint indentation remained, not unusual in itself, except that it was accompanied by a small dark thread caught in the weave of the fabric. Picking it up carefully with tweezers, Hamish recognized it immediately. The thread was not from the chair, nor from any garment the late Mrs. Maclaren would have worn. It was fine wool, dyed a deep burgundy, fraying slightly at the end, and yet it was out of place, almost like a fingerprint of the person who had been there last. He decided to cross-check the staff once more, speaking with Miss Lorna in the kitchen, where she was attempting to appear busy, but whose hands fidgeted with the hem of her apron. "Did you notice anything unusual yesterday, Miss Lorna? Anything that seemed out of place?" he asked gently. Her eyes flicked toward the door, and Hamish caught the micro-expression, the fraction of a second hesitation, a tension in her jaw. She shook her head. "No, constable. Everything was normal, really." But Hamish had seen the glance, the subtle reaction betraying more than she intended. The human eye was rarely so honest. Deception lingered in gestures and in the silence between words. Hamish returned to the study, retracing each movement of the previous day. The ledger, blank beyond yesterday's date, called to him once again. He ran a fingertip along the edge of the open page and felt the faintest impression of writing, letters indented into the paper as if someone had penned them and then lifted the pen without leaving ink. He retrieved a magnifying glass from his coat pocket and carefully examined the page. There it was. A barely perceptible scrawl, a date and a name, written yesterday but erased so cleverly that it was almost invisible. The letters were familiar, yet the company. Text was unclear, teasing him with their partial disclosure. Someone had left a clue, yet had masked it, a whisper of intent that only a keen observer could detect. Hamish's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle from these subtle observations, the tilted frame, the wax-stained snowdrop, the burgundy thread, the hidden message in the ledger, all spoke of premeditation and cunning. He realized that the murderer was not someone clumsy or panicked, but a person capable of careful calculation, someone who understood the effect of small details on a perceptive eye. And if the first layer of the deception had already been unveiled through these minute anomalies, the deeper truth, the motive, the method, the identity, was still hidden, waiting for him to follow the trail that others would never even see. By mid-afternoon, Hamish had assembled his first set of theories, tentative but compelling. Each clue hinted at a deliberate plan, a narrative constructed with precision. He noted the reactions of the staff once more, catalogued the minor irregularities in the room, and felt that subtle thrill that always preceded the unravelling of a complex mystery. The snow outside had intensified, drifting in long, silent columns past the windows, and Hamish understood that time was pressing. The murderer had planned every detail, but he had already begun reading the story they thought would remain unread, and Lochdu's quiet streets were about to reveal secrets that had seemed safely buried beneath the glittering snow. The evening drew in early over Lochdu, the sky a bruised grey that mirrored the village's uneasy mood. Inside the McLaren estate, Hamish paced quietly, reflecting on the fragments of evidence he had gathered so far. He knew that to uncover the truth, he would have to listen not only to what people said, but to what they tried not to say, to the silences and the half-truths. That hid more than any confession. One by one, he summoned those closest to Mrs. McLaren, beginning with the household staff, each interview revealing subtle inconsistencies that would have escaped a less observant eye. Miss Lorna, the maid, had been the first to speak with him that morning, her hands trembling slightly as she served him a cup of tea she insisted was perfectly normal, as always. She recounted seeing Mrs. McLaren retire to her study the previous evening, locking the door behind her. Yet when pressed gently on whether she had seen anyone enter or leave after that, she hesitated, eyes flicking toward the corner of the kitchen as if recalling a detail she had tried to forget. I don't think anyone did, she said finally, voice tight. The choice of words, the stammer and the glance, small, almost imperceptible, hinted at a memory she was reluctant to admit. Hamish noted it silently, filing it alongside the burgundy thread and the wax-stained snowdrop, each minor detail a stitch in the pattern of deception. NXT, he spoke with Mr. Ferguson, the gardener, who had spent the day maintaining the estate's evergreens. Ferguson was a man of routine, comfortable in his work but evasive when the topic shifted to the household's movements. I was out by the greenhouse most of the afternoon, he insisted, and yet when Hamish asked him to recount the exact hours, the timeline he provided had subtle gaps. Well, I might have come back inside briefly, perhaps, he admitted grudgingly. The inconsistency was slight, almost trivial, yet Hamish felt the first stirrings of a theory. Someone had taken advantage of those brief lapses, moving with intent under the guise of ordinary activity. And the neighbours provided conflicting accounts. Mrs. Carmichael, who lived across the lane, had noticed nothing unusual the previous evening, though her eyes betrayed an eagerness to appear cooperative, almost rehearsed. She mentioned seeing a figure in a dark coat near the McLaren gate at dusk. Yet when Hamish asked her to describe the figure, she faltered. I didn't look closely, she said. It all happened so quickly. The hesitation, the careful vagueness suggested a memory filtered through caution or perhaps guilt. Hamish filed the detail, aware that the selective truth often revealed more than outright lies. He returned to the staff one final time, observing Miss Lorna and Ferguson together in the kitchen. Their interactions were polite but guarded, measured as if they were both trying to maintain a narrative. Hamish had learned long ago that the dance of deception often involved subtle cues, a touch on the arm, a glance exchanged, a pause too long in conversation. Watching them, he sensed an unspoken communication, the kind that could point toward complicity, or, at the very least, shared knowledge. Hen there was the family solicitor, Mr. McIntyre, who had arrived to review Mrs. McLaren's papers and oversee the execution of her affairs. He spoke in precise, clipped sentences, eager to maintain control of the conversation. Mrs. MacLaren was most particular about her study, he explained, and I assure you, any visitor would have been noted immediately. Yet even as he spoke, Hamish detected a subtle defensiveness, a slight tightening around the eyes, as if the solicitor had something he wished to hide, or feared being implicated in inadvertently. The small contradictions mounted, eager cooperation that masked anxiety, carefully chosen words that avoided revealing the full picture, and tiny admissions that hinted at deeper truths. By 8 afternoon, Hamish had assembled a mosaic of voices, each fragment contributing to a larger, still incomplete image. The contradictions, the evasions, and the almost imperceptible gestures pointed to a complex web of motives, each person's account bending slightly to protect themselves or someone else. The snow drifted outside, thickening against the windows, muffling the village in quiet, and Hamish felt the familiar tension that came before a breakthrough. In the faces before him, in the polished lies and hesitant truths, he saw the first outlines of the story that had led to Mrs. MacLaren's death. The murder was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated event, one that required patience, planning, and manipulation. Somewhere within these intertwined accounts lay the key, the identity of the murderer, and the reason behind the perfect haunting placement of the snowdrop. And Hamish, with his keen eye for deception and his patience for unravelling the truth, was determined to uncover it. As dusk settled over Whodunit, casting long, trembling shadows across the snow-laden streets, Hamish retreated to his small office in the police station, a steaming mug of tea cradled in his hands. The village outside was silent, save for the occasional creak of a shutter or the crunch of snow under a cautious boot. Inside, his mind whirred with the labyrinth of stories he had collected throughout the day. Each witness, each staff member, and each neighbour had presented a fragment of truth, yet none of the fragments aligned neatly. Motives, Hamish realised, were seldom singular. They were a tangle of human emotion, a maze of desires and resentments that twisted and overlapped. E began with Miss Lorna. Her nervous gestures and hesitant recollections suggested more than mere forgetfulness. She had been devoted to Mrs. MacLaren for years, yet Hamish could not ignore the faint signs of resentment, small complaints overheard in passing, a tone in her voice that suggested envy, perhaps of the late woman's independence or wealth. It was possible, he mused, that loyalty and jealousy could coexist, creating the perfect storm for a calculated act. Lorna's alibi was weak. She had been alone in the kitchen when Mrs. MacLaren retired to her study. No one could fully corroborate her movements, which left a dangerous gap, though one he could not yet label as guilt. R. Ferguson, by contrast, had appeared outwardly calm, yet the tiny gaps in his timeline gnawed at Hamish's instincts. The gardener had access to the grounds, knew the house intimately, and could move unnoticed in and out of the property. His reason, though less overt than Lorna's, was subtler, a simmering frustration at being overlooked, a desire for recognition, perhaps a hope that removing Mrs. MacLaren would shift control of the estate's fortunes, or even just his place within it. Hamish jotted notes beside the burgundy thread, considering whether it might belong to a coat Ferguson owned, a small but telling signature of his presence in the study. To end there was Mr. McIntyre, the solicitor, who seemed above suspicion at first glance, but whose precise, almost surgical way of speaking carried its own weight of secrecy. He had a professional duty to the estate, yes, but also knowledge of the financial arrangements, the will, and potentially any grudges that might have lingered between Mrs. MacLaren and extended family. A subtle tightening of his jaw during questioning hinted at worry, perhaps fear of discovery, perhaps anticipation of benefit. Hamish noted the ease with which the solicitor had deflected questions, careful to mention what he should, leaving out what mattered. It was a motive layered in opportunity and subtle self-interest, quietly powerful yet easily overlooked by those who accepted his composed exterior at face value. Eve, the neighbours, seemingly innocent observers of the unfolding drama, had their own hidden motives. Mrs. Carmichael's eagerness to be helpful, the SL, exaggeration in her story about the shadowy figure near the gate, suggested curiosity intertwined with a desire to influence events, or perhaps to mask something she had seen but dared not disclose. Human nature, Hamish reflected, was a complex weave of fear, desire, and self-preservation, and every thread might conceal a hidden truth. As he mapped these connections, Hamish realized that the motive maze was more intricate than he had first suspected. Greed intersected with jealousy, fear mingled with loyalty, and revenge hid behind carefully maintained facades. No single theory explained every anomaly. No simple chain of cause and effect accounted for all the subtle contradictions he had observed. The snowdrop, the wax smear, the burgundy thread, they were pieces of a puzzle entwined with human emotion, each element pointing toward a deliberate orchestration rather than chance. Hamish spread out his notes, sketches of alibis and timelines overlapping in a messy grid. Lorna in the kitchen, Ferguson near the greenhouse, McIntyre at his desk reviewing papers, Mrs. Carmichael watching from across the lane. Their paths intersected and diverged in ways that created opportunities for both observation and misdirection. The gaps, the contradictions, the almost imperceptible hints of duplicity, began to form a faint pattern, though he could not yet trace its full contours. Somewhere within this tangled web lay the answer, the identity of the person who had planned the murder, placed the snowdrop, and manipulated events to make a perfectly sealed room appear impenetrable. Hamish leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as the fire in the hearth crackled low. The maze of motives was dense and confounding, but it was a maze he could navigate, step by careful step. One false move or ignored detail could mislead him, but his patience and observation had brought him this far, and he trusted they would carry him closer to the truth. Somewhere in the silent, snowbound village, the murderer had thought they had crafted a perfect, unbreakable story. Hamish knew better. Stories, no matter how carefully constructed, always revealed themselves to the eyes willing to see beyond the surface, and he intended to see everything. The following morning brought a brittle clarity to Whodunit, the kind of cold that sharpened every edge of the snow-covered village and made footprints stand out like deliberate markers in white dust. Hamish arrived at the McLaren estate just as Inspector Clough was bustling in with an air of triumph, a small bundle of evidence clutched in his gloved hands. "We've got it," Clough declared, thrusting the burgundy thread toward Hamish. "Found it on Mr. Ferguson's coat during a routine check. It's the link we needed." "Case closed." Hamish held the thread between his fingers, noting its frayed tip and the subtle inconsistencies that had already set his mind racing. It matched the fragment he had discovered on the chair in the study, yes, but the context still felt incomplete. Clough, oblivious to the nuances, was already drafting a report, planning to parade the gardener in front of the village as the confessed culprit. The satisfaction in the inspector's posture was palpable, yet Hamish's instincts prickled with unease. He had learned long ago that the surface could be deceptive, that what appeared to be a breakthrough was often a carefully constructed illusion. Gardener Ferguson looked uneasy as Clough approached him, hands raised in a resigned gesture. I don't know how it got there," Ferguson stammered. "It must have been from work. I didn't—" His protest was genuine in tone, yet even he couldn't mask the automatic, almost mechanical compliance with authority, a learned behaviour in a man accustomed to following orders rather than questioning them. Hamish studied Ferguson closely, noting the subtle tension in his shoulders and the micro-expression of relief that accompanied the mention of the thread. A relief tinged with something deeper, perhaps fear, perhaps recognition that the inspector had accepted the simplest explanation. Hamish allowed the other authorities to celebrate their apparent victory, watching as the narrative settled neatly into place. Ferguson's coat had matched the thread. The locked room had been explained through minor overlooked details, and a suspect had been conveniently identified. Clough beamed, congratulating himself for a case seemingly solved. Villagers whispered of closure, of justice served, and even some of the staff appeared relieved, as though the presence of an assigned culprit could erase the lingering unease of the murder. Yet Hamish felt the disquiet simmering beneath the celebratory veneer. The snowdrop, the wax mark, the hidden writing in the ledger, they all suggested careful orchestration. Ferguson's coat and the burgundy thread were too convenient, too easy to present as a smoking gun. There was an artistry in the crime, a deliberation that clashed with the idea of a gardener committing murder on a whim. Hamish could almost see the shadow behind the apparent simplicity, a figure patiently orchestrating each piece, waiting for the right moment while others scrambled to assign blame. He revisited the study alone, the stillness of the room now punctuated only by the soft tick of the grandfather clock, the desk, the chair, the snowdrop. Everything was unchanged, yet charged with significance. Hamish allowed his gaze to wander, retracing the movements of the previous day, reviewing each detail with deliberate care. The ledger, the smudged frame, the imperceptible impressions on the floor, they all whispered a story different from the one being braced by the authorities. The gardener might be guilty of minor missteps, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but the full orchestration, the clever staging, belonged to someone else entirely. He also noted the staff's subtle relief, the way Miss Lorna's shoulders relaxed just slightly, and how McIntyre allowed a fleeting, almost imperceptible smirk when the thread was presented. The human instinct to breathe easier when danger seems to have been assigned to another was unmistakable, and Hamish knew these tiny reactions were as telling as any forensic clue. The celebration of a solved case in this instance was a mirage. The true culprit remained hidden in plain sight, watching the unfolding drama with the patience of a predator s. The afternoon light waned. Hamish stepped outside, snow crunching beneath his boots, the village muffled under a quiet blanket of white. Clough continued to interview Ferguson and compile reports, confident that the breakthrough had sealed the investigation. But Hamish, his gaze sweeping the rooftops and the silent streets, felt the weight of unfinished business pressing on him. The case was far from closed. The murderer's shadow lingered over Whodunit, unseen yet present, and Hamish understood that the real confrontation, the one that would expose the clever, patient mind behind the staged murder, was still to come. The snowdrop on the desk, pristine and deliberate, seemed to mock him gently, reminding him that appearances were never the full story, and that a false victory could be far more dangerous than none at all. The following morning, a pale winter sun cast a muted glow over Whodunit, and Hamish found himself retracing the village paths he had walked countless times, his mind circling the threads of the case like a hawk circling prey. The false resolution announced by Clough the day before still lingered, but Hamish did not shake the feeling that he was missing a layer hidden beneath the surface. He returned to the Maclaren estate, not to re-examine the crime scene alone, but to dig into the histories of those involved, convinced that the key to the present lay buried in the past. Hamish began by reviewing old police reports, files long filed away in dusty cabinets that few in Whodunit had ever bothered to revisit. One in particular caught his attention, a burglary from over a decade ago, quietly noted in passing at the time as a minor event, with little follow-up. The homeowner had been a distant relative of Mrs. Maclaren, a woman of modest means compared to the late widow, and the suspect, never fully proven guilty, had been Mr. McIntyre, the solicitor who now managed the Maclaren estate. The memory of the case, long dormant, suddenly reframed the present. McIntyre's meticulous nature, the subtle defensiveness Hamish had observed, the almost imperceptible smirk during the false breakthrough. It was not arrogance, but a confidence born of experience, a man who knew how to manipulate outcomes and escape scrutiny. H's thoughts turned to the household staff, particularly Miss Lorna. He recalled her nervous glances, her whispered complaints about Mrs. Maclaren's rigidity, and a detail from her past she had never openly shared, a previous employment in the household of the Maclarens' distant cousin, where she had quietly left under mysterious circumstances. The files suggested financial discrepancies, subtle thefts, and the quiet disappearance of small valuables, never pinned conclusively on her, but enough to hint at a pattern of opportunistic behaviour. Hamish realised the threads connecting Lorna, Ferguson, and even McIntyre might extend beyond mere motive. They intersected through histories, grievances, and old alliances. Turning back to the study, he examined the objects that had in it. Irely caught his eye, the wax-stained snowdrop, the tilted frame, the hidden writing in the ledger. Each seemed deliberately placed, a signature rather than a spontaneous act. And now, understanding the past misdeeds of those involved, he began to see the narrative take shape. This was not a simple crime of greed or passion. It was an orchestration of opportunity informed by experience, an act designed to exploit weaknesses, to frame a convenient scapegoat, and to manipulate the perception of others while the true culprit remained untouched. Hamish called Miss Lorna into the study again, under the pretense of routine questioning, and observed her reaction closely. The woman seemed uneasy, almost as if the room itself reminded her of things she had hoped were long forgotten. "Miss Lorna," he began gently, "there's more to this than you've told me. Past employment, past incidents. Perhaps you think they've been forgotten, but I've been looking into records." Her eyes widened slightly, the first genuine crack in her practiced composure. She tried to recover with a polite cough, but the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders betrayed her. Hamish noted everything. The hesitation, the micro-expressions, the minute shift in tone that hinted at guilt, or at least knowledge far deeper than the staff had previously admitted. The gardener, Ferguson, also carried shadows of the past, though less overtly criminal than those of Lorna or McIntyre. His frustrations had roots in long-standing grievances with the McLaren family, disputes over wages, and a simmering resentment of authority. Hamish realised that Ferguson had been positioned perfectly as the convenient suspect, not necessarily the mastermind, but the one whose past and circumstances made him believable in the eyes of others. A carefully arranged puppet, a necessary piece in a narrative woven with long-forgotten threads, Bop B.L. 8 afternoon, Hamish began to map the intricate connections, the hidden histories, and the overlaps of personal interest and opportunity. He understood that the murder was a culmination not just of present-day motives, but of old, unresolved tensions and past misdeeds. The crime, so perfectly staged, had roots that ran deep into history, exploiting knowledge of habits, weaknesses, and secrets that had been quietly stored in the minds of those involved. The snowdrop, the wax mark, the ledger, all were echoes of a strategy informed by experience, a careful exploitation of human behaviour honed over years. As Hamish stepped out into the cold, snow crunching beneath his boots, he felt the threads of the past interweaving with the present. The village, so quiet under its blanket of white, seemed to hum with hidden stories, each one a piece of the complex puzzle he was unravelling. The true perpetrator, he realised, was not the obvious scapegoat, but someone who had studied history and human nature alike, someone patient enough to wait for the right moment to act. And Hamish, now more certain than ever, understood that to catch this criminal, he would have to follow the shadows of the past all the way into the present, tracing every concealed motive and unspoken secret until the web was fully exposed. Hamish returned to the McLaren estate that evening, the snow drifting in gentle curtains across the streets, muffling the usual village sounds. Inside, the house seemed more oppressive than ever, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and the tension of a case unresolved. He had spent the day tracing past connections and assembling the intricate web of motives, yet the identity of the true murderer remained elusive. The usual methods, interviews, observations, timelines, had only taken him so far. Tonight, he decided, it was time for an unconventional approach, one that relied less on tangible evidence and more on the subtle workings of the human mind. Hamish gathered the household staff in the drawing-room under the pretext of discussing minor procedural matters. The fire flickered, casting shifting shadows across the room, and the air was thick with anticipation. He had prepared a simple psychological exercise, something that seemed innocuous but would test reactions under pressure. A small stack of envelopes lay on the table, each containing a brief note with a cryptic statement about the late Mrs. McLaren's study. Phrases like, "I saw no one else could," or "the room tells its secrets only to the observant." The idea was to observe not what they said, but how they responded, to catch the slight hesitations, micro-expressions, or compulsive adjustments that betrayed deeper knowledge or guilt. Miss Lorna was the first to approach, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for an envelope. Hamish watched carefully as she read the note, her eyes flicking up briefly to gauge his expression before settling back on the paper. She read aloud, her voice steady. "I saw what no one else could." Her hesitation came not in the words themselves, but in the infinitesimal pause afterward, a subtle shift in posture, a tightening of the jaw. Hamish noted it, filing it alongside the previous micro-reactions that suggested she held more knowledge than she admitted. Ext, Ferguson moved forward, casual at first, though Hamish detected the slight tension in his shoulders. He read his envelope silently, then aloud. "The room tells its secrets only to the observant." A faint smile crossed his lips, too quick and too controlled, betraying a flicker of amusement, or perhaps relief. He laughed nervously, brushing his hand across his coat as if to shake off a phantom dusting. Hamish observed the minor details, the rapid blink, the slight shift of weight from one foe, to another, the momentary flash of recognition in his eyes. The man was reacting to something in the phrasing, something that had touched closer to reality than he expected. Hamish allowed the moment to linger, saying nothing, letting the room hold its quiet tension. The ordinary observers, Clough, the neighbours who had gathered to watch, the servants, saw only a curious exercise, a quaint mental diversion. But Hamish, attuned to subtleties, could read far more. The reactions, minor as they were, indicated that both Lorna and Ferguson were keyed into some hidden layer of the crime. It was not merely physical evidence that could betray a murderer, it was the mind itself, betraying truths through involuntary expressions. Then Hamish turned to McIntyre, the solicitor, who had been quietly observing from a corner. "And you, Mr. McIntyre," he said softly, placing an envelope in front of him. "Try this one. See what it tells you." McIntyre's fingers lingered over the envelope just for a fraction of a second too long before he opened it. His eyes darted to the message, and a flicker of tension crossed his face, almost imperceptible. Unlike the others, he did not read aloud. He held the note close, lips pressed together, jaw tightening. The moment was fleeting, yet it was enough. Hamish saw it, a subtle crack in the carefully maintained facade, a split-second betrayal of the carefully cultivated composure he had displayed throughout the investigation. Ish allowed the silence to stretch, pressing gently with questions that seemed innocuous. "Do any of these phrases remind you of anything from the past, Mr. McIntyre?" he asked. The solicitor's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and then, carefully masking his reaction, he shook his head. But the very delay, the fraction of a second hesitation, confirmed what Hamish had suspected. The man carried memories, knowledge, involvement that went far deeper than appearances suggested. By the end of the evening, Hamish had not only observed these subtle reactions, but also mapped them against the known facts, past histories and motives. The psychological exercise had revealed what physical evidence could not. The tension points in each suspect, the cracks in their armour of deception, and the silent acknowledgement that someone in the room knew more than they were willing to say. The snow fell steadily outside, yet inside, Hamish's mind was alight with the realization that the unconventional clue, the test of character, had drawn forth the first true sign of the murderer's presence. He now had a direction, subtle yet unmistakable, and he could feel the puzzle edges beginning to shift, aligning toward a revelation that had been carefully hidden until now. The following morning, Hamish returned to the McLaren estate with a renewed sense of focus, his mind still replaying the subtle reactions from the previous evening's exercise. The flicker of tension in McIntyre's eyes, Ferguson's nervous smile, Lorna's almost imperceptible pause, they had all left him with a thread to pull, a path that promised to unravel the final pieces of the puzzle. Yet as he approached the study, the familiar quiet of the house seemed off, almost strained, as if the air itself were aware that something had shifted. BR first. Side, the room appeared unchanged at first glance. The snowdrop rested in its usual place on the desk, the ledger lay open to the faint impressions he had discovered, and the burgundy thread still clung to the chair's cushion. But when Hamish moved closer to examine the ledger again, his heart sank. The page that had revealed the hidden writing, the subtle scrawl he had been studying, a barely discernible message, was gone. The page had been torn cleanly from the book, leaving only an empty margin behind. Delicate impressions, erased in an instant, were no longer there to guide him. Hamish's pulse quickened. He scanned the room, noting the absence of any signs of forced entry. Whoever had taken the evidence had done so with precision and care, entering and leaving without a trace. The meticulousness of the act confirmed what Hamish had feared. Someone was aware of his investigation, someone intent on obscuring the truth before it could fully emerge. The stakes had risen overnight, and the seemingly secure threads of his case were suddenly tenuous, as though a subtle wind had blown through the carefully laid web of clues. He called for Miss Lorna and Ferguson to be brought into the room, ostensibly to review the ledger for procedural purposes, but Hamish's eyes were sharp, watching every flicker of expression. Lorna's eyes widened slightly at the empty page, a tiny tremor of guilt, or perhaps fear, passing across her face before she forced a calm demeanour. Ferguson's composure was steadier, but the faint blush creeping along his neck betrayed the slightest apprehension. Hamish noted the differences carefully. Micro-expressions often revealed more than words, and in this delicate game of observation, he could read the currents of emotion like an open map. Turning his attention to McIntyre, Hamish found the solicitor waiting with his usual composure, though even he could not hide the slightest tightening around the mouth. "I'm sure it was a simple accident," McIntyre said, voice measured. "Perhaps a page dislodged in the handling of the ledger." But Hamish did not believe him. The clean tear, the absence of disarray, the deliberate removal, all spoke of intent. This was no accident, and the one responsible had knowledge of the ledger's importance, a foresight that suggested a calculated effort to manipulate the investigation. Hamish paced the room slowly, noting every detail that remained. The snowdrop, pristine as ever, seemed almost to mock him, a symbol of the murderer's careful orchestration. The chair and its burgundy thread, the wax-stained tip of the flower, the subtle scuff in the carpet, all were now underscored by the sudden absence of the ledger page. Trust had become fragile as the thin winter light streaming through the frost-smeared windows. Every person in the room could be complicit, and the destruction of this single piece of evidence threatened to unravel months of careful observation. Yet Hamish was undeterred. If someone had taken the page, it meant they feared what he might discover. It was a silent acknowledgement that the investigation was closing in, that the truth was precariously close to emerging from the shadows. He resolved to retrace the last movements within the house, to observe the subtle routines and deviations that might reveal the intruder. Every glance, every hesitation, every minor shift in behaviour could provide a clue where physical evidence had vanished. By mid-afternoon, Hamish had established a controlled plan. He would monitor the suspects closely, follow their routines, and recreate the movements of the previous day with an acute eye for irregularities. The missing ledger page was a blow, but it was also a signal. Someone was watching, someone was acting to protect themselves or manipulate the investigation, and that awareness gave Hamish a strategic advantage. The case was no longer only about deciphering motives or unravelling the past. It had become a chess game of wits, with the murderer actively countering each step. And Hamish, ever patient and observant, understood that the shadows would reveal themselves in the smallest of details, if only he watched closely enough. The game had changed, the stakes were higher, and the silent, snowbound village of Whodunit waited, tense and expectant, for the moves that would lead to the ultimate truth. The late afternoon shadows had stretched long across Whodunit when Hamish returned to the station, the snow crunching beneath his boots in a rhythm that matched the tension coiling in his mind. He had spent the day retracing movements, observing subtle behaviours, and noting irregularities in the routines of Lorna, Ferguson, and McIntyre. Every interaction, every glance, every hesitation had been catalogued, yet the missing ledger page continued to loom over the case like a ghost. As he pored over his notes, trying to anticipate the next move of the unseen manipulator, a sudden call on the station phone made him freeze. "Constable Macbeth," said the breathless voice of Miss Lorna. It's the study. There's been another incident." Hamish grabbed his coat and bolted for the McLaren estate, heart hammering with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The snowstorm had intensified, swirling in chaotic gusts that stung his face, but he pressed on, boots sliding over icy patches, mind already racing. By the time he reached the front door, The house was in controlled chaos, neighbours peering from windows, the remaining staff clustered in the hallway, and Inspector Clough running frantically toward him. "Hat's happened?" Hamish demanded, brushing snow from his coat. Tease Mr. Ferguson," Clough gasped, his usual self-assurance cracked by panic. He's been found in the greenhouse. Dead. Someone's done this. It looks brutal." Hamish followed quickly to the greenhouse where the glass panes were fogged with condensation, distorted by the cold outside. Inside, Ferguson lay sprawled among overturned pots and scattered soil, his face pale, eyes wide in the frozen expression of shock. There was a thin trickle of blood along his temple, and the careful arrangement of the greenhouse had been violently disturbed. Hamish's stomach tightened. The stakes had shifted dramatically. What had been a carefully staged murder was now part of a broader, more dangerous pattern. The killer was not finished. He surveyed the scene with rapid, methodical precision. Nothing else appeared missing. The objects and tools were scattered from the force of the attack, yet some items seemed deliberately untouched, almost as if to create a controlled chaos that hinted at theatricality. Hamish knelt, brushing aside soil and examining footprints. The paths were erratic, inconsistent with Ferguson's own movements, and he noted subtle overlaps that suggested someone had carefully planned the scene to mislead any observer. Whoever had done this was clever, patient, and frighteningly confident. The impact on the remaining suspects was immediate. Lorna, standing near the doorway, clutched her apron, lips trembling, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and guilt. She stammered out an explanation, insisting she had not seen anyone approach, that she had been elsewhere tending the fire. Her story was plausible but riddled with micro-delays and slight contradictions, tiny inconsistencies that Hamish had learned to detect. McIntyre, who had followed Hamish reluctantly, maintained an outward calm, but even he could not conceal the minute tightening around his eyes, the subtle contraction of his jaw that betrayed a flash of apprehension. The sudden violence was a reminder that the game was far from over, and that the person orchestrating these events had more to lose, or gain, than anyone had imagined. Hamish felt the old adrenaline stir, the sharp focus that came when a case shifted from analysis to urgent pursuit. This was no longer only about unravelling a past crime, it was now about predicting the next move, preventing further violence, and staying ahead of a mind that was several steps beyond the average criminal. The snowstorm outside mirrored the turmoil within the house, chaotic, obscuring visibility, forcing him to rely on instinct, deduction, and careful observation more than ever. He retraced every interaction of the day, comparing the patterns, the reactions, and the subtle hints to the new reality before him. One thing was clear. Ferguson's death was not a simple continuation of Mrs. MacLaren's murder. It was a deliberate escalation, a warning, and a move to tighten control over the investigation. The killer was watching, adapting, and manipulating the narrative in real time. Hamish understood that every second now counted. The fragile sense of momentum he had built with his observations and psychological insights could be undermined in an instant. Standing amid the shattered greenhouse, Hamish felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. The snow outside muted the world, but inside, danger pulsed palpably through the quiet corridors of the estate. The case had shifted from reconstruction to confrontation, and Hamish knew that the path ahead required both meticulous reasoning and rapid action. The unexpected twist had arrived, and with it the understanding that the murderer was still at large, calculating every move, and willing to strike again if given the opportunity. The next steps would be decisive, and the margin for error had narrowed to nothing. Hamish spent the night poring over every detail of the recent events, the snowstorm outside thick and relentless. Mutin. The village to a silent world. In the quiet of the station he laid out his notes, sketches, and observations like pieces of a puzzle, determined to find the thread that connected the two deaths. Ferguson's greenhouse murder had been violent, almost impulsive in appearance, yet the more Hamish studied the scene, the more deliberate it seemed. The chaos was calculated, meant to mislead, to create the illusion of spontaneity, while the real message remained, hidden for those perceptive enough to see it. As he reviewed the interactions from the previous day, Hamish's mind returned to the minor details, the micro-expressions, the fleeting gestures, the comments that had initially seemed trivial. One remark by Miss Lorna lingered when asked about Ferguson's movements. She had said, almost offhandedly, "He's always in a hurry, isn't he?" The phrase had felt innocuous at the time, an idle observation about the gardener's habitual briskness. But now it clicked. The statement was revealing not about Ferguson, but about timing. The killer had exploited Ferguson's routines, moving precisely when he would be out of the way, using the predictability of habit as a weapon. Hamish stood and retraced the sequence of events in his mind, connecting the small threads that had seemed inconsequential. The burgundy thread, the wax-stained snowdrop, the hidden scrawl in the ledger. They were all markers, subtle signposts left to control perception, each timed and placed with an almost theatrical precision. And now, Ferguson's murder, with its stage disarray, fell into the same pattern. The killer orchestrated each scene to appear chaotic, to obscure intent, while signalling to the observant eye that every act had been deliberate. The pattern was emerging not in the grandeur of the acts, but in the minutiae, in the tiny controlled anomalies that suggested control and forethought. Returning to the McLaren estate, Hamish revisited the study, the greenhouse, and the spaces in between, moving as he had before with careful attention to every angle, every object, every residue of human activity. In the study, the snowdrop rested in the same position, now heavy with symbolic weight. In the greenhouse, the displaced pots formed subtle, almost imperceptible lines when viewed from above, as if the chaos had been carefully sculpted to convey meaning. Then it struck him, the positioning of items, the small disruptions, even the very words the suspects had spoken, all were being used to manipulate observers, to steer attention toward or away from certain conclusions. The pattern was not just in the acts themselves, but in the storytelling of the crime. Hamish also returned to the ledger, inspecting the now empty page where the hidden writing had been torn away. He recalled the impressions, faint though they were, and realized that even the removal of evidence fit the pattern, a test of reaction, a measure of how much the investigator would notice and interpret. The murderer was guiding the investigation through absence as much as presence, using human curiosity and deduction as instruments in a game carefully crafted over months, even years. A smaller, almost overlooked detail crystallized the connection. The snowdrop had never been random. It had appeared in the first room, the study, at the center of the initial investigation, deliberately pristine, wax-stained at the stem. Its symbolism, a promise, a fragile beauty, a hidden message, mirrored the killer's approach, outwardly innocent but layered with intent. Every placement, every gesture, every anomaly now made sense as part of a single, coherent strategy. The murderer was methodical, psychologically astute, and confident enough to manipulate both evidence and emotion simultaneously. Hamish leaned back in study chair, the pieces settling into a clearer picture. The false victory, the vanishing ledger page, the escalation to Ferguson's death. All were elements of a pattern that had been visible all along to someone with the patience to observe and the mind to connect them. The key to the case had never been a single explosive revelation, but the subtle orchestration of detail, the things everyone else dismissed as trivial, minor, or coincidental. Now, seeing the pattern, Hamish understood the scope of the challenge before him. The murderer was brilliant, patient, and several steps ahead, but Hamish also knew that, with the pattern revealed, the next moves of the killer would be constrained, their strategy traceable, their methods predictable. The invisible lines connecting motive, opportunity, and manipulation had finally been drawn, and for the first time Hamish could see the shape of the truth looming from the shadows. The stillness of the evening hung heavily over Whodunit as Hamish walked the snow-crusted paths toward the McLaren estate, the wind carrying a sharp bite that seemed to echo the tension settling in his mind. The pattern he had uncovered, the meticulous orchestration of chaos, the subtle manipulation of reactions, the calculated misdirection, was now clear. Yet the motive that drove it remained obscured behind layers of artifice. Hamish knew that understanding why the crimes had been committed was the key to predicting the final move and bringing the murderer to justice. Inside the house, the remaining staff and Clough awaited his return, anxious for guidance, unaware that the breakthrough lay not in another discovery of evidence, but in a confrontation with human psychology. Hamish gathered them in the drawing room, allowing the firelight to illuminate each face as he spoke slowly, deliberately, framing the conversation to elicit more than mere facts. He asked questions not of actions, but of feelings, probing the emotional currents that ran beneath the surface, and watching closely for the flickers that betrayed more than words could ever convey. It was Lorna who first betrayed the hidden depth of the crime. As Hamish described the emerging pattern, the orchestration, the deliberate staging, the psychological manipulation, her composure faltered, her hands twisted nervously in her apron, her eyes darting briefly to McIntyre, and then to the empty doorway of the study, as if measuring unseen consequences. A confession began to take shape in the tremor of her voice, the almost imperceptible nods, and the slight shudder as she struggled to maintain the calm exterior she had so carefully cultivated. Hamish did not push aggressively. He let the weight of observation and the quiet inevitability of discovery press upon her. The crimes, Hamish said gently, were not only about securing a will, controlling property, or punishing someone for a grievance. They were about control in a deeper sense, a manipulation of trust, perception, and belief. Someone wanted to dominate the narrative itself, to decide who lived, who died, and who believed what. The physical evidence, the ledger, the thread, the snowdrop, was merely the language through which this control was exercised. Pause hung in the air. Lorna's lips parted, then closed again. Finally she whispered, voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. It wasn't the money. It was never the money. It was the way she made us all feel small, invisible, powerless. I couldn't bear it anymore, and I didn't want anyone else to challenge me. I wanted to be the one who decided. The revelation struck Hamish with the quiet force of inevitability. The crime was driven by a psychological need for dominance, a desire to impose control over life, death, and perception itself. It was intimate, perverse, and chillingly rational in its own twisted way. Hamish turned his gaze to McIntyre, noting the subtle tension that had persisted since the disappearance of the ledger page. Even the solicitor, whose calm demeanour had been a fortress, now betrayed the faintest ripple of recognition, a micro-expression of acknowledgement that the confession aligned with truths he had long suspected but had not anticipated being articulated so openly. Ferguson's death, the initial murder, the carefully constructed chaos, they were all tools in the execution of a need far more abstract and profound than the petty motives everyone else had assumed. As the layers of deception peeled away, Hamish understood the terrifying precision of the criminal mind before him. The murders had been designed not merely to remove obstacles, but to assert psychological supremacy, to orchestrate fear, doubt, and compliance among those closest to the victims. The snowdrop, the wax, the ledger, these were symbols in a carefully constructed narrative, each chosen to reinforce control, each movement calculated to elicit specific reactions. It was an artistry of manipulation, a dark psychology that sought to dominate not just life, but perception itself. Hamish allowed the realization to settle, observing Lorna as she sat, tense and fragile, finely unguarded. Her motive was no longer a conventional mix of greed or revenge. It was a deeply personal assertion of dominance, a need to control the fates and beliefs of those around her. The truth explained the meticulous planning, the psychological games, and the escalation from the initial murder to Ferguson's violent end. Every act had been intended to cement power, to demonstrate that the murderer controlled the narrative in its entirety, dictating who believed what, who lived, and who perished under their silent authority. In that moment, Hamish recognized the scope of the challenge ahead. The revelation of the hidden motive transformed the investigation. This was no longer merely about piecing together events, but about understanding a mind willing to manipulate reality itself. He knew that capturing the criminal would require more than evidence. It would require anticipation, strategy, and a comprehension of the dark psychology that had driven the crimes from the very start. The killer's reasoning, as twisted and chilling as it was, had now been exposed, and with that knowledge, Hamish felt the first real grip on the solution tighten. The case, long shrouded in snow, shadows, and deception, was finally beginning to yield its ultimate truth. Hamish spent the evening preparing meticulously, every detail considered, every possibility accounted for. The revelation of Lorna's hidden motive had clarified everything. The orchestration, the manipulations, even the vanished ledger page now fit seamlessly into her design. But he knew better than to act without a plan. Lorna was intelligent, calculating, and ruthless in her pursuit of control. Any misstep, any hint of impatience could allow her to vanish into the night, or worse, escalate further. He needed a setting where every escape route could be observed and every reaction carefully measured. He arranged for the household to gather in the drawing room under the pretense of discussing safety measures, the storm outside continuing to hammer against the windows, isolating the house from the village. Clough and a small contingent of constables were positioned discreetly near all exits, while Hamish moved with calm authority, projecting the composed presence that had so often allowed him to read people with precision. Lorna arrived, seemingly relaxed, though Hamish detected the almost imperceptible tension in her gait, the faint flicker in her eyes as they scanned the recessing possibilities. She did not know, he thought, that every exit was covered, every movement under silent scrutiny. Hamish began speaking in an even, measured tone, recounting the events from the first murder to Ferguson's death, each fact carefully selected to emphasize the inescapable pattern of orchestration and control. He described the snowdrop, the wax, the ledger page, the subtle manipulations, drawing Lorna's attention without accusing. Each sentence was a brushstroke, painting the portrait of a crime so meticulously designed that it could only have been executed by someone both clever and psychologically attuned. He watched her reactions closely, the micro-expressions, the slight tightening of her hands, the faint flush across her cheeks, and allowed the weight of the narrative to press upon her. Finally, Hamish paused, letting silence settle in the room like a physical presence. "It's clear now," he said softly, voice calm, precise. "Someone has been controlling not only events, but perception. Someone orchestrated every reaction, every misunderstanding, and every false lead, and the person capable of such meticulous manipulation is among us." His eyes met Lorna's, steady and unwavering. "It's you, Miss Lorna, and the moment has come to make a choice." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Lorna's lips tightened, and she leaned slightly forward, voice quiet but edged with defiance. "You can't prove anything. You've been reading shadows and patterns, but I—" She broke off, eyes flicking to the nearest window, then to the back door. Her body tensed, and Hamish noted the slight shift in weight, the almost imperceptible lean toward escape. He allowed the moment to stretch, knowing she would act first if she chose to. Then, with calm precision, he stepped closer, voice unwavering. "I've already pieced it together, every detail, every reaction, every deliberate misdirection. There's no need for words, Miss Lorna. You've already spoken through your actions, your choices, and your careful orchestration." The tension in her shoulders snapped like a cord under strain. With a sudden, desperate gesture, Lorna lunged toward the sideboard, knocking over a lamp in a frantic bid to create distraction and cover. Hamish reacted instantly, stepping to intercept, the precision of his movements leaving no room for error. Two constables moved in from their concealed positions, restraining her firmly but carefully. Her eyes, wide and defiant, met Hamish's one last time, the realization of defeat flickering across her features. "It was never just about money," Hamish said quietly, voice carrying the calm inevitability of understanding. "It was about control. Control over lives, over perceptions, over fear. You sought to dominate not only events, but everyone in this house. That need for power has brought us here." Lorna sagged against the constable's hold, her breath ragged, and for the first time Hamish saw vulnerability mingled with the remnants of pride. The meticulous planner, the orchestrator of chaos, had finally been contained. Outside, the storm continued to lash the windows, but inside the house, a tense stillness replaced the charged atmosphere, the sense of imminent danger dissipating as the villain's machinations came to an abrupt halt. Hamish took a measured breath, surveying the room, the staff, and the small contingent of constab. Less. The pieces of the puzzle were finally in place. Every clue, every subtle gesture, every carefully staged misdirection had led to this moment. And while the village of Whodunit would awaken to the aftermath of shocking events, Hamish felt the quiet satisfaction of resolution, not in triumphal celebration, but in the deep certainty that every thread had been accounted for, every deception unravelled, and the shadow that had haunted the village was finally brought to light. Hamish had barely allowed himself a moment to exhale when a sharp knock at the drawing-room door broke the fragile calm. The constables, still holding Lorna, tensed reflexively, but Hamish raised a hand to stop them. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and a voice called out from the hallway, "Inspector Macbeth, you need to see this, now!" Hamish's brow furrowed as he stepped toward the door, signalling for Clough to follow. Outside, the night storm had intensified, wind howling through the eaves and rattling the windows, but the urgency in the visitor's tone left no room for doubt. Hamish followed swiftly, boots crunching against the icy path, toward the rear of the house where one of the smaller storage rooms had been hastily converted into an archive. Inside, the scene that met him was unexpected. McIntyre stood by the table, a man usually so controlled now pale and tense, holding a small bundle of documents. The firelight from the hearth cast flickering shadows across his features, and Hamish noted that even the solicitor's carefully measured composure had faltered. These weren't meant to be found," McIntyre muttered, almost to himself, glancing at the bundle. He handed the papers to Hamish, who unfolded them with methodical care. T.E. documents were meticulous, almost obsessive in their detail, letters, account books, and correspondence dating back years, connecting the MCLA, Wren family to various estates, business partners, and legal arrangements. But what drew Hamish's attention most was a small coded notation tucked into a corner of a ledger page, referencing dates and movements that precisely aligned with both murders. And then, most startling of all, a set of initials, not Lorna's, not Ferguson's, but a set Hamish had seen before, one that had appeared subtly in earlier correspondence and notes from the late Mrs. McLaren herself. M.C. Hamish's mind raced. M.C. McIntyre. He had known the solicitor was clever, observant, and subtly manipulative, but the depth of involvement revealed in these papers suggested something far more sinister than he had anticipated. Every action Lorna had taken, every staged clue, even the disappearance of the ledger page, now appeared to have been guided, at least in part, by someone else entirely. Lorna had been the instrument, the hand executing the plan, but the mind orchestrating the events with surgical precision had been McIntyre all along, but the realization was dizzying in its clarity. Hamish turned slowly to McIntyre, who met his gaze with an unreadable expression, the calm facade he had maintained all along now teetering on the brink. You were guiding it?" Hamish asked quietly, carefully letting the weight of the statement hang in the air. "All this time, manipulating evidence, observing reactions, even allowing Lorna to take the blame. It was your design." But McIntyre's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly, but the coldness in his eyes betrayed the truth. "Clever, aren't you, Constable? Yes, I guided it. But you're still a step behind. I had no intention of harming Ferguson. He was collateral, a means to an end. Lorna's zeal made her useful. And you, observing shadows and patterns, were necessary to confirm the precision of the design." His voice was calm, almost clinical. Yet the conf. Eschen carried the weight of a mind willing to manipulate lives without moral restraint. Hamish felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. The game had shifted once more. The final resolution he had believed in was now complicated by the revelation that the true mastermind had remained hidden until the very last moment. Yet he did not flinch, did not show the smallest hint of surprise beyond what the situation demanded. He had anticipated the possibility of deeper layers, and his mind worked rapidly to adjust, to integrate this final piece into the sequence of events. Slowly, Hamish began to reconstruct the chronology, the subtle psychological nudges, the misdirections, and the careful orchestration of fear and observation. Every detail now made sense in a new light. The vanished ledger page, the snowdrop, the wax mark, the staged chaos in the greenhouse, and Lorna's own reactions. All threads in a far larger tapestry woven by McIntyre. And yet, for all the brilliance of the solicitor's planning, The very fact that he had revealed these documents to Hamish, however reluctantly, was itself a vulnerability, a crack in his armour born of overconfidence. Hamish's voice was steady as he addressed McIntyre, the constables moving quietly to flank him. "Your manipulation ends tonight. Every move, every calculation, every psychological test you employed to control events has been anticipated. You misjudged the constancy of observation, the patience of reasoning. The case is not over, McIntyre. It's just entering the final stage. And you, finally, will be held accountable." Storm outside continued to rage, but inside the tension crystallized, charged with the quiet inevitability of justice closing in. McIntyre's subtle smirk faded, replaced by a shadow of calculation as he considered his options. The room tight, every exit monitored, every reaction under SCR. Whodunit, the last-minute twist had arrived, shaking the very foundation of the case. But Hamish, unflinching, prepared to meet it head-on, confident that the full brilliance of the investigation would now bring the long, complex game to its ultimate conclusion. Hamish watched McIntyre carefully, noting every micro-expression, every twitch of muscle in the face of a man who had orchestrated chaos with painstaking care. The solicitor's calm exterior was fracturing, revealing glimpses of the meticulous mind that had driven the murders and manipulations all along. Outside, the wind rattled against the windows, snow drifting in thick curtains, but inside the drawing room, the atmosphere was taut with quiet inevitability. Hamish spoke slowly, letting each word land, weighing the impact carefully. "McIntyre," he began, voice even and deliberate. "The pattern of events, the murders, the vanishing evidence, the orchestrated reactions, they all pointed to you. Lorna was merely a tool, Ferguson an unfortunate necessity. Every subtle gesture, every staged clue, every micro-expression she displayed was carefully provoked, guided, and predicted by you. And yet, the very details you overlooked, the faint impressions in the ledger, the wax on the snowdrop, the deliberate micro-delays in her statements, have all led to this moment." And McIntyre's lips pressed into a thin line, and his gaze darted briefly to the storm outside, perhaps calculating a final chance for escape. Hamish did not move, did not waver. "You relied on the assumption that chaos would obscure intention, that human error would mask the truth. But the truth was never hidden from careful observation, McIntyre. Every step you took, every move you made was recorded in the patterns of human behavior you sought to manipulate." He walked slowly around the room, letting the weight of evidence and reason settle in the space between. "End them. Consider the ledger. You removed the page to test reactions, to see if the investigator would notice. That action alone betrayed knowledge beyond the obvious, pointing to someone intimately familiar with the house and the history of the McLaren family. Then the snowdrop, the wax, placed precisely to direct attention, to suggest innocence while signalling guilt to the observant eye. Even Ferguson's death followed a script so precise it seemed impulsive, yet it was calculated to confirm your control over timing, predictability, and human reaction. B.R. McIntyre's hands twitched slightly, betraying a flicker of panic beneath the cultivated calm. Hamish seized the moment of psychological pressure, pressing forward with calm authority. "And yet here we are. Your own overconfidence, your reliance on perfection in human behavior, has been your undoing. The documents you kept hidden, the coded notations, even the subtleties of your micro-expressions, they have revealed your orchestration. There is nowhere to hide, and nothing you can do to alter what the evidence, observation, and deduction have already exposed." For a long, tense moment, McIntyre did not speak. Then, almost imperceptibly, the slightest quiver ran across his face. Hamish noted it without flinching, the faintest crack in the armour of a man who had manipulated events for months. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence within, but Hamish remained calm, the eye of a quiet, intellectual hurricane. He gestured toward the waiting constables. "McIntyre, you are under arrest for the murders of Mrs. McLaren and Mr. Ferguson, as well as for orchestrating a deliberate manipulation of evidence and witness perception. There is nothing left unsaid. no hidden move unaccounted for. B.R. McIntyre's expression hardened, the smirk replaced by resignation tinged with pride. "Very well," he said softly, almost admiringly. "You were perceptive. I underestimated you. Perhaps that is the only reason I am standing here." He allowed the constables to secure him, his composure returning just enough to maintain dignity, yet the certainty of his capture was undeniable. Hamish turned to the remaining household members, who watched in stunned silence, and explained carefully how each clue had led to the ultimate revelation. The seemingly random gestures, the staged chaos, the disappearance of evidence, and even the psychological manipulation of Lorna, all had pointed to a mind far more calculating than anyone had anticipated. "The brilliance of detection," he said quietly, "lies not only in observing what is present, but in understanding what is absent, what is implied, and what is deliberately constructed to mislead. Every subtle detail here, every hesitation and reaction, has spoken the truth to those willing to see it." As the constables led McIntyre away, the storm outside began to abate, snow settling into a quieter rhythm. The village of Whodunit, though still shaken, would awaken to a resolution forged by observation, reasoning, and patience. Hamish remained in the drawing-room a moment longer, surveying the subtle signs he had noted throughout the investigation. The wax-stained snowdrop, the tilted frame, the faint impressions in the ledger, and allowed a rare moment of satisfaction to settle in his mind. Justice, in the end, had been served, not through brute force, but through the careful unravelling of manipulation, the patient tracing of patterns, and the understanding of the human mind in all its subtle complexity. Yet even as he closed the case, Hamish felt the lingering unease that always followed such investigations, the awareness that human cunning never sleeps, that subtle deceptions persist in hidden corners, and that the next challenge, while unknown, would always demand the same vigilance. The village slept under its blanket of snow, justice restored for now, but the echoes of calculated minds and shadowed intentions would remain, a reminder that in Whodunit, even peace is never quite absolute. The village of Whodunit had settled into an uneasy quiet, the storm finally ebbing to a soft swirling snow that coated the roofs and streets in a pristine, deceptive calm. Hamish walked along the narrow paths, the crunch of snow under his boots punctuating the silence. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp winter air, but inside his mind the gears of deduction still turned, methodical and unrelenting. The case had been resolved, the true villain apprehended, yet a faint unease tugged at the edges of his thoughts. Something, he realized, still did not quite fit. As he passed the McLaren estate one last time, Hamish's gaze lingered on the study window. Inside, the house was quiet, the remaining household members beginning the slow process of returning to normal routines. Yet his mind drifted back to the ledger, to the subtle impressions he had studied long before the torn page, and to the snowdrop, wax-stained and delicate, resting in its pot as if deliberately positioned for observation. Something about it, something so small, had never fully made sense. He paused, crouching to examine a faint smudge on the windowsill, nearly imperceptible but present nonetheless. A residue of movement, perhaps, or a trace of something that had been overlooked. Hamish allowed his eyes to sweep the surroundings carefully, noting the small footprints left by the constables and the fading impressions of the wind on the snow. His mind reconstructed the final confrontation, McIntyre's subtle smirk, the hesitation in Lorna's movements, the almost imperceptible flicker of recognition when the ledger documents were revealed. Each reaction had fit a pattern, yet one minor anomaly nagged at him, a slight inconsistency in the timeline of the second murder, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, but which now whispered the possibility of an overlooked thread. Faint memory surfaced, a comment from Mrs. McLaren long ago, mentioned in passing by the housekeeper, a fleeting remark about a visitor she had never trusted, someone who had been seen around the estate in the weeks leading up to the winter festival. At the time, it had seemed trivial, unrelated to the murders that followed, but now, with the resolution of the known crimes, Hamish could not dismiss the thought entirely. Could there have been another presence, another observer, whose role had been hidden by layers of misdirection? The possibility was tantalizing, unsettling, and exhilarating all at once. Rose and continued down the lane, the snow sparkling under the pale light of a rising moon. Even with McIntyre in custody, even with Lorna safe, and Ferguson's death accounted for, Hamish's mind remained alive to the subtle interplay of human behaviour, the tiny details that spoke volumes if one cared to notice. The village seemed to exhale in relief, but Hamish knew that relief was always temporary. The world contained too many shadows, too many unspoken motives, for any peace to last indefinitely. Flicker of movement caught his eye, a small dark figure slipping between the snow-laden trees along the edge of the path. Hamish paused, considering, watching, but the figure vanished before he could approach. No words, no confrontation, only a fleeting shadow. It was the smallest of hints, barely perceptible, yet enough to remind him that mysteries rarely ended completely. There were always threads left untied, subtle clues overlooked, patterns not yet fully revealed. Even as the snow settled over Whodunit, the mind behind the crimes, or at least the echoes of cunning and deceit, might linger unseen, waiting for opportunity. Hamish resumed walking, the wind tugging at his coat, the village stretching quietly around him. He allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The known had been resolved, but the unknown, the unpredictable, always remained a step ahead. His senses sharpened with quiet anticipation, for the mind that observed, the patience that deduced, and the insight that connected subtle truths, the tools of a detective, were never at rest. In the fading glow of winter moonlight, Hamish turned toward the horizon, aware that the case was closed, but that the world beyond, Whodunit, still held secrets, puzzles, and mysteries waiting to be revealed. And as he walked into the night, one subtle detail continued to flicker in his mind, a hint, a shadow, a question mark, reminding that in the life of a detective no ending was ever truly final. The SN Ow whispered around him, a quiet reminder that every solution was only the precursor to the next puzzle, and that somewhere, in some hidden corner, another mystery already awaited.